What is the difference between single-ply yarn and a two-ply yarn? In weaving, single-ply yarn is often called singles. Even though the word is plural, there's only one strand of yarn that makes up the whole yarn. So you can see there's just that one strand of yarn. It has some twist to it. If I untwist it, it will fall apart. That is one of the reasons why single-ply yarn is considered a little bit more difficult to weave with. This is a two-ply yarn by contrast, and a single strand is made up of two plies. If I untwist this a little bit, they will separate to some degree, but they're still going to curl up against each other. That is a two-ply yarn. I have here on my table a bunch of different pieces of fabric that were made with single-ply yarn. It's actually one of the more efficient ways to create fabric because you don't have to go through the effort of plying. This is the one example that I have of a knitted single-ply yarn. And you can kind of see that the way that those columns form is very characteristic of a single-ply yarn. It just has to do with the way that the yarn is twisted in a knit stitch. This can be really lovely on something like a shawl like this. It can cause some issues with sweaters where there's some biasing, so it might want to twist on your body in a certain direction. A single-ply yarn is a little bit more prone to pilling, especially if you're dealing with wool. The rest of my samples are woven, and I'm going to start with some commercially woven fabric. This is just some fabric that I picked up from the fabric store. It is linen. The way that I know that it is single-ply is that I just unravel a little bit from the cloth and I take a close look at it. Now this is fairly fine yarn, so the other way that I can confirm that it is a single ply is to do that same untwisting that I did before, and it just falls apart. That tells me that it's a single ply yarn. This is a lovely linen, all single ply. This is machine woven and most likely machine spun at the price point that I bought it for. This is going to be just a very common fabric that you can buy. It's kind of an upholstery weight. So before you go and say, oh, it has to be completely machine made, this is actually a scrap of khadi cotton. Khadi is from India. It is completely hand spun and hand woven. Again, this is extremely fine. This is a scrap from a dress that I made. And if I just unravel a single thread, you can see how fine that is. That is hand spun and hand woven. These skills are not lost. We can still do them today. I like to talk a lot about one of my early weaving experiences, which is when a weaving teacher told me that you shouldn't weave with single ply yarn, and I went home and I made this piece of fabric. I had originally intended it to be a scarf, and it ended up being a little bit too bulky for that. What I did was I felted it, and it's now a series of trivets and pads that I put under plants and other heavy objects in my home. It's a 1-3 weave, so that's the difference. You can see that the front is more warp faced and the back is more weft faced. The yarn that I used for that sample is probably Malabrigo in their 100% wool line. It is a very strong yarn, and the reason that I was probably successful with it was that it's probably been fulled or felted a little bit on the outside after it was dyed or as part of the dyeing process, and that felting process actually makes it a lot stronger. Here's another example of hand-woven, hand-spun fabric. This is yarn that I spun myself, all of it, both in the warp and the weft. I wove this on my rigid heddle loom, and this is the yarn that I used. Now this is not nearly as strong as the Malabrigo. You see that just drifted apart right there. So that wouldn't normally be considered strong enough to be a warp yarn. But when you're gentle with your yarns, you can actually get away with quite a lot, even if they're not normally yarns that would be suitable for warp. Lastly, these two fabrics are both woven from the same warp. It's silk, and this is the silk that I used. It's very fine, probably a 61, but it's very strong because the silk fibers are very long. It doesn't take a lot of effort to break that yarn, but it has a nice snap to it when it breaks, so I know that it's suitable for warp. I weave these on my Saori loom, which is a 2-shaft counterbalance loom. And you can see that this fabric is very fine, very floaty. All of that is single ply. This is woven on the same warp, but it has a thicker weft, so it obscures the warp. And you can see that that's just a very supple, very nice fabric. Every single one of these fabrics was made with single ply yarn. It's not a big deal. It's actually something that's very doable, and I really encourage you to try weaving with it and see how it works out for you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.